الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله. أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله. حي على الصلاة. حي على حي على الفلاح. حي على الفلاح. الله أكبر الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله.
السلام عليكم.
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. حي على الصلاة. حي على الصلاة. حي على الفلاح. حي على الفلاح. الله أكبر الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله. وصل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وآل محمد.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والحمد لله رب العالمين، وسبحان الله العلي العظيم. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على حبيب القلوب محمد النبي الأمين المرسل رحمة للعالمين، وعلى آله الميامين، وعلى صحبه المختارين، وعلى من اتبعوا بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. اللهم يا علي يا عظيم يا رب العالمين، اللهم لا تزغ قلوبنا بعد أن هديتنا، وهب لنا من لدنك رحمة يا رب العالمين، وافتح بيننا وبين قومنا بالحق وأنت خير الفاتحين. ربنا وآتنا ما وعدتنا على رسلك ولا تخزنا يوم القيامة. ربنا عليك توكلنا وإليك أنبنا وإليك المصير، فاغفر لنا ذنوبنا وكفر عنا سيئاتنا وتوفنا مع الأبرار يا الله يا أكرم الأكرمين. سبحانك رب العزة عما يصفون، وسلام على المرسلين، والحمد لله رب العالمين. As is my practice before I give the Khutbah Jum'ah, I usually do family and friends help me by sending me articles that sort of give me a survey of issues in the world. And of course, as usual, and unfortunately, and to the persistent heartbreak You find the repeated stories of violations and egregious offenses that are repeatedly committed against Muslims, and repeated offenses committed by Israelis. Once again, the Israelis attack um, cars or institutions or buildings belonging to the United Nations. And once again, you find repeated stories of atrocities committed by Israeli forces and the monkey business of the leaders of Muslim countries, whether Egypt and Qatar, running around basically playing the role of appeasers and distractors as they try doing nothing more than trying to beg the Israelis not to escalate further or to have a ceasefire or some other very basically the consistent position of weak people from weak positions appealing for weak solutions and appealing for weak solutions from people that they perceive as pretty much all powerful and all dominant and all sovereign. While it is clear from the position of Muslim leaders that they themselves see their own sovereignty and their own autonomy and their own ability as severely compromised and severely constrained. And so many stories about how persistent Israeli violations has made the West Bank on the brink of an explosion. Add to that the repeated stories that one reads about how experts all over the world, including experts connected to the United Nations or the Secretary General for the millionth time, warning about dire consequences to the planet if pollution degrees remain the same. And of course, as is a persistent theme in these stories, that those who are actually causing the most damage to the planet, when all is said and done, are not those who are going to pay the highest cost for the destruction being caused to the planet when the time comes. It is going to be the typical people that have been paying the cost for most atrocities, and that is since modernity. Darker skinned people in more indigenous cultures and more native cultures that will pay the price as the same people that have dominated this planet for the past few hundred years. In summary, the white race, especially of the West European stock, that cause the most damage and get away with the most. In this sense, there's hardly anything new. And in this sense, it is the same old, same old. But all of this begs the persistent question of what is our place as Muslims in all of this? What is our role? What is our challenge? We are supposed to be believing people. And believing people live in the full realization that they are in the full gaze of their Lord and their Maker. As believing people, it would simply be a fundamental paradox and a fundamental inconsistency to conduct our life or conduct our affairs oblivious to the realization or the full awareness that we are in Allah's full gaze, in God's full gaze all the time. Now, moreover, it would simply be a thoroughly, not just illogical, but pathological for us to persist in a world in which there is the same old, same old. The minute you say there is the same old, the minute you concede that not just in our lifetime, but indeed for the past few hundred years, the news when it comes to Muslims, if you play the role of a historian, even just for a short while, assuming the role of a historian just for a short while, and you look with an eye of a historian, you very quickly realize that what we have unfolding in Palestine, the persistent brutalization of a Muslim people, whether now it's happening in Palestine, but from an eye of a historian, that persistent brutalization of Muslims has been unfolding, has been taking place since the age of colonialism. The places in the world differ. So, at one point, it is the brutalization of Muslims in a place like Madagascar, which we don't even think of as Muslim anymore. But it is the persistent dynamics of brutalization and persistent onslaught of colonialism and the persistent activism of non-Muslim to change the reality of the ground, most particularly missionaries, and the very aggressive missionary activity in Muslim lands to change the reality in the ground And if it's not a place like Madagascar, well, you have Timbuktu for a very long time. You have Sham, the history that led to the breakup of Sham into Lebanon and Syria and Jordan, etc., etc. You have, of course, the brutalization that took place in Algeria, the brutalization that took place, the stories of brutalization. The Indian subcontinent is its own long history. Anyway, that consistent theme of brutalization that has gone hand in hand with colonization and also gone hand in hand with modern history of racism. They're inseparable. Racism, colonization, and the brutalization, not just of Muslims, but it is time that Muslims just wake up and confront the historical reality that their brutalization is inseparable from the brutalization of numerous indigenous people. And the targeting of indigenous populations and indigenous cultures and the onslaught of white racism and colonialism has all gone hand in hand. All of that for any rational Muslim, any thinking Muslim, would pose the obvious question. Well, if we have the same old, and our reactions have been pretty much identically the same. There are acts of resistance every once in a while. The acts of resistance ultimately are all exhausted and depleted, and they're consistently depleted pretty much through the same dynamics. The world in which we live, Muslims no longer count in any weighted, serious fashion. The thinking, rational Muslim would say, well, if you have the same old problems and the same old solutions have not been working, the inescapable conclusion that one reaches is that we need radical change. The same old cannot, if the same old does not work, I must recognize that reality. And I must come to terms with that reality. And I must, in fact, honor that reality through radical honesty with the self, radical honesty that what has not been working continues to not work, and there must be new trajectories and new ways. If you don't do that, it leads to something that is a consistent and persistent Muslim theme. And again, it's not exclusively Muslim, it's not uniquely Muslim, but it is a theme with all traumatized people who do not come to terms with their trauma and do not deliberately and intentionally, with full intentionality, work to change the dynamics of this trauma, and that is disassociation. You have an overwhelming reality, a reality that is consistently traumatic and persistently so, and you are responding to this reality through the same modes, the same dynamics, time after time. These responses have not worked, continue not to work, and will never work. And subconsciously, because Allah has put within us intuitively a knowledge of the truth, when we know that this is the situation we are in, what happens? Well, what happens, we disassociate. And disassociation takes many different forms. But disassociation, to put it this way, being high is a form of disassociation. Being drunk is a form of disassociation. Disassociation is an indulgence in irrationality. It is the ultimate form of distraction from one's reality, where you live, although objective empirical indications point one way, and although you concede that these are the objective empirical indications, but your response to this empirical objective reality is a mismatch. It doesn't jive. So, for instance, you say, I fully believe in Allah, and I believe that all things are in Allah's hands, and I believe that all good comes from Allah and all losses come from Allah. But your actual life, the way you manage this life, exhibits that, in fact, you don't trust and you don't, in fact, put your reliance and your confidence in your Maker. That is a form of disassociation. In my opinion, even kufr is a form of disassociation. We know Allah primordially. In fact, before we come to this physical world, we are with our Maker. We are part of Allah's knowledge. We are inseparable from our Maker. And we come to this world with intuitive awareness of our Maker. But it is the consistent paradoxes that confront us in life that force us to deny what we know intuitively and what we know to be the truth within our heart. And in my opinion, kufr itself is a form of disassociation. It's a form of disassociation to know that everything has a logical cause, that in our material world, everything comes from something, that everything that has an end must have a beginning, and yet adopt the entirely illogical position that although this is exactly the law of causality in our material world, and yet convince ourselves that something came out of nothing, and that although everything we know in this world has an end, we tell ourselves, well, it had no beginning. And we somehow convince ourselves that this is an enlightened position, that this is a logical position, that somehow this is even a rational position. In reality, it is the height of irrationality. And in my opinion, it is a form of disassociation. You are, for reasons that you could not make things jive, you've adopted the disassociation of believing that, well, yeah, sure, everything comes from something in this material world, but I'm going to believe there is no God. And I'm going to believe that somehow this entire universe sprang out of nothing. But this association itself is a matter of degrees and levels. The height of this association is when you know that the bills are not going to pay themselves, or that if you don't study, you're not going to be able to do well in life, and yet convince yourself that somehow magically you're going to be okay. And you slack off on whatever you need to do. And you live in a fictional world of fictional beliefs. And it's a form of disassociation. Or even foggy memories itself, foggy memories themselves, when you subconsciously, your mind refuses to remember the details or misremembers the details or invent details that were not even present. It's a form of disassociation. We disassociate in all types of ways to cope, not necessarily in a healthy way, and quite often, in fact, not in a healthy way. But it is a coping mechanism, and it could be very destructive. If you study indigenous populations that have been colonized, you will find the way that indigenous populations relate to their own culture, relate to the meaningfulness of their own culture, suffers from a great degree of disassociation. You will often find that the way that colonized indigenous cultures attempt to honor or remember or preserve their native cultures to suffer from a lot of painful gaps in logic. It's a form of disassociation. I would submit to you that modern Muslim cultures, especially for Muslims that come from Muslim lands, but unfortunately, among so many converts who, for instance, after becoming Muslim, because they're impressed by Islam's enlightening energy, its open-mindedness, its pragmatism over other systems of faith, what they do then is escape to a tradition that is more fiction than reality. a tradition that is hundreds of years old that requires a great deal of training to even comprehend and convince themselves that these symbolisms of the past is somehow a sufficient articulation of Islamicity. It's a form of disassociation. And disassociation, because to disassociate is often much easier than to confront the reality and to think systematically and consistently about what problems you must come to terms with and what solutions you need to deliberately pursue in order to deal with problems. But here's the most concrete example and why I chose to talk about this today. I received a letter, and unfortunately, it's not an unusual letter. I received so many of these letters. But this one, for different reasons, the letter, as I said, like so many, is written by a Muslim born and raised in the West to a family, to parents from the Muslim world. It doesn't matter whether they're Indo-Pak or Arab or whatever, it doesn't matter. This person, raised by their family as a Muslim, as so many young Muslims, gets to a point where they tell themselves what they experience is a crisis of faith. In fact, the crisis of faith reaches the point where, according to them, it reaches the point of kufr, that they no longer identify or relate as a Muslim. And as I said, in my view, already this person being raised in their family probably experienced so many moments of irreconcilable paradoxes that they disassociated, in my opinion, through kufr. Anyway, and as happens in so many of the letters that I get, Allah has guided them to the halaqas and the khutbahs of Usuli, and listening through to the halaqas and the khutbahs, they start feeling re-anchored in their faith, reconnected to their Islam, and return to their Islamicity through their journey with Usuli material. Now, again, I would submit to you that the reason Usuli appeals to people like this writer is that the Islam that Usuli teaches requires you or teaches you to be present, fully present in the moment. You don't disassociate through mythical beliefs. You don't tell yourself, well, it doesn't matter because I'm waiting for the Mahdi or the awaited Savior, the return of whoever figure it is. Or, oh, it doesn't matter because we are waiting for the Dajjal. This is all disassociated people. People who live their Islam by basically fantasizing about the evils of the Dajjal or the Antichrist or the wonders of the Mahdi. All of that are forms of disassociation. And that is why this material is so insanely popular. Because we are a traumatized people, a disassociated people. So this person, the writer of that letter, finds their way back to Islam. But then, now, the world that confronts them are the realities of the ugliness of what is happening to Palestinians, or you could add to that what is happening to Muslims in China, or what is happening to Muslims in India, or so on. And they become active in doing what they believe God requires of them, living in the full eyesight and the full gaze of their Lord. They, like any human being who is present in the moment, want consistency between the principles they ascribe to and how these principles, the mandates, the normative implications of these principles in their life. But alas, as often happens, and this, by the way, to give you historical perspective, is not something new. This has been happening since the dawn of colonialism. And what has happened is that this person, being active in their university campus, protesting Israeli atrocities, bringing attention to the plight of Palestinians, doing what they believe their Lord and Maker requires of them, clashed with their parents. Their parents see this as entirely unwise, entirely unsafe, and they order their daughter to stop protesting. And a particular rub, and people, because again, we are not a historically literate people, you have no clue how persistent this has been since the dawn of colonialism. I can sit here and tell you stories upon stories upon stories of younger people from the time that Napoleon landed on Egyptian seashores. Younger people who told their parents, it is time for us to resist, and their parents said, shut up, stay home, stay safe. Now, of course, as has been happening now for centuries, their parents cite the same old argument from, just so you see the extent of this association that I'm talking about. So their parents will consistently cite to the same old argument about, if you respected me, you would obey me. And Allah has commanded that you respect me. It is an Islamic obligation that you respect me. And because it's an Islamic obligation that you respect me when I tell you that you should not protest, you should not translate the principles that you've learned about your Islam into action, and you in fact should prefer safety the way we see it as your parents. If you disobey, you are acting un-Islamically, you're being a bad Muslim because you are dishonoring your parents. Now, first, there is a point that is so incongruent, so insanely inconsistent, that when I point it out, you will see the extent to which it traumatized people disassociate. What is this point? Can you imagine? I want you to just imagine with me for a second that in fact Islam did in fact come to teach obedience and respect are one and the same. I want you to pretend that, to assume that. Now I want you to imagine what the effect of that would have been on the birth of Islam and the growth of Islam from its genesis till today. If Islam would in fact have taught that if you disobey, you are dishonoring your parents, there would have been no Muslims. Because anyone who would have studied the seerah would have known that one of the major complaints of the Qurayshis against the Prophet ﷺ is that he was getting kids to rebel against their parents. A consistent theme against the Prophet ﷺ is that you are turning kids against their parents. Kids are breaking away with the Qurayshi traditions, following you, Muhammad, and disobeying us as their parents. And even, as we all know, it led even to military confrontations between children and their parents in some of the battles. But then the disassociated Muslim mind will say, but no. See, this was different because these were kuffar. But if the parents are Muslim, then the distinction between obedience and respect is valid if the parents are not Muslim. So in other words, we can separate obedience from respect if the parents are not Muslim. If the parents are not Muslim, then disobeying your parents, in fact, is not necessarily disrespectful, if the parents are not Muslim. But the implication then is the parents are Muslim, then obedience and respect are one and the same. Then obedience and respect are one and the same. And that's exactly the argument that the parents of this woman used. If you respected us, you would obey us. But mom, but dad, the entire risala of Muhammad ﷺ was anchored, was built by disobedient kids. No. Don't listen to these Usuli people on this Khalid Abul Fadl, because these were kuffar parents. That's why it was okay to disobey. But when the parents are Muslim, then to respect the parents, you have to obey the parents. And I have a very simple question to that. Where do you get that from? Where do you get that from? Allah in Surah Al-Ankabut, and repeats it again in Surah Luqman. But in Surah Al-Ankabut tells us وَوَصَّيْنَا الْإِنسَانَ بِوَالِدَيْهِ حُسْنًا. وَوَصَّيْنَا الْإِنسَانَ بِوَالِدَيْهِ حُسْنًا وَإِنْ جَاهَدَاكَ لِتُشْرِكَ بِي مَا لَيْسَ لَكَ بِهِ عِلْمٌ فَلَا تُطِعْهُمَا. Okay. In Surah Luqman, it says, فَلَا تُطِعْهُمَا وَصَاحِبْهُمَا فِي الدُّنْيَا مَعْرُوفًا. So, first Allah says in Surah Al-Ankabut, we commanded for a people, our command to human beings. It doesn't say Muslims, in fact, it says al-insana, human being. بِوَالِدَيْهِ حُسْنًا, to treat their parents decently, kindly, generously, honorably. All of that are included in the word husna. But وَإِنْ جَاهَدَاكَ لِتُشْرِكَ بِي مَا لَيْسَ لَكَ بِهِ عِلْمٌ. Now, if they try to jahadaka, they try to force you, they in fact pressure you, jahadaka, if they pressure you, does it say pressure you litakfura bi, to disbelieve in me? No. Litushrika bi, to associate partners with me. Now, if you check all the tafsirs, you will find tafsirs stall when it comes to this expression, مَا لَيْسَ لَكَ بِهِ عِلْمٌ. Because the way these tafsirs deal with it makes that expression superfluous. Why would it say to associate partners and then add, not just associate partners, not just to litushrika bi and it stops, but it says to associate partnerships or to associate partners to me what you do not, ما ليس لك به علم, what you do not understand, what you do not comprehend, or what you do not believe in. Don't obey them. Later on in Surah Al-Ankabut, Allah then goes on to in fact say, not just in the ayah that follows it, right? Follows it. What does Allah follow with this ayah about obedience to one's parents with? Allah follows it with وَمِنَ النَّاسِ مَنْ يَقُولُ آمَنَّا بِاللَّهِ فَإِذَا أُوذِيَ فِي اللَّهِ جَعَلَ فِتْنَةَ النَّاسِ كَعَذَابِ اللَّهِ. What Allah follows it with is not to talk about kufr. Allah is talking about people who make being harmed, being hurt by fellow human beings equal in gravity or even worse in gravity than Allah's punishment. In other words, Allah is saying, Allah, after telling you, don't associate partners and don't associate, in fact, especially what you do not understand or what you do not believe in. And I'll give you an example of precisely what would that mean. But then Allah goes on and says, and there are people who fear, effectively, who fear their fellow human beings more than they fear God. They're worried about being harmed by fellow human beings more than they're worried about being harmed by God. And then what Allah goes on to explain and tell us about, وَلِيَعْلَمَنَّ اللَّهُ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَلِيَعْلَمَنَّ الْمُنَافِقِينَ. Right after that, Allah says, and Allah will know the difference between those who believe and those who are hypocrites. So people, the context of the ayat are very clear. It's not talking about your parents trying to force you to be a kafir, to not believe in Allah. It's talking about your parents trying to force you to associate partners and associate. Why does it say مَا لَيْسَ لَكَ بِهِ عِلْمٌ? To associate partnerships with Allah in a way that is not convincing and not persuasive to you. In other words, it forces you in a way that forces you to adopt what you don't believe. Allah is saying, when you in fact blindly obey your parents and fear human beings more than you fear me, not only are you a munafiq and a kazib, not only are you lying as to your faith, but you're a hypocrite. And that hypocrisy is a form of shirk. Because remember, associating partners with God are many different types and degrees. When I fear my fellow human being more than I fear God, and I obey a fellow human being because of my fear of fellow human beings, that's shirk, and that's nifaq. So Allah, in fact, who separated between respect and obedience, it's not Khalid Abu Fadl, it is Allah. Because Allah categorically starts out by saying, honor your parents. But then tells you, honoring your parents doesn't mean obeying your parents. Doesn't mean it. Because, فَلَا تُطَعْهُمَا. And to make it clear, Allah is not talking about that distinction in the context of kufr. Those who refuse to obey their parents by becoming Muslim. No. It's in the context of who you fear. Do you fear human beings more or do you fear God more? In the context of not being a hypocrite. In the context of not being fake and false in your belief, i.e. a liar. So, if that's the case, why isn't it, if the text is so obvious, and once you explain it, it is so obvious that you wonder, how could the people gotten it wrong? It's not me or anyone else that distinguished between honoring someone and obeying someone. It is Allah who did. In the clear text, on its face, as lawyers say. If that is the case, then how could it be that so many people get it wrong? And so many people have gotten it wrong for centuries. And my response to you is disassociation. That false consciousness, when people are saddled by generational mistakes. One of the worst things about trauma is that it lives generationally. And the way it passes from generation to generation to generation is precisely that the fears and the anxieties and the mental hang-ups and the failures of an earlier generation is passed on to the generation that follows. It could take the form of an abusive father or an abusive mother. It could take the form of a father who yells and screams or insults or beats. But it could also take the form of a cowardly father and a cowardly mother. It could take the form of an emotionally unavailable father or an emotionally unavailable mother. But it could also take the form of an intellectually dull or intellectually pathetic father or an intellectually pathetic mother. Generational trauma. This is how despotism lives. This is how despotism lives. Dictatorial societies are dictatorial societies not because what is passed on are the insults and the beatings, but what is passed on are the normative psychological conditions for despotism and authoritarianism. Among those is to equate obedience with honor. Obeying someone and honoring someone. Among those is to say, I believe in God, but you teach your kids to be afraid of human beings more than they're afraid of God. Among those is to feel insecure and unsafe in the world, because that's what despotism teaches you. Unsafety, insecurity. And because I'm unsafe and insecure, I can't trust anyone. And my protection is money. Among those is to teach your kids you're not worth anything unless you're an engineer or a doctor and your bank account keeps increasing, the balance in your bank account. Listen, if you read history, I have always wondered, why is it that all the adventurers of modernity are white? Why is it that you find always a white person who rose to the peak of this mountain or that mountain, or who discovered this channel or this channel, that channel, or who did all the scientific experiments until they figured out electricity or whatnot? They're not genetically superior, but it is because the way they were brought up generationally taught them to be present in the moment, not to disassociate. That white person learned from their generational heritage. You want a difference in this world? You have to make it yourself. You can't rely on anyone else. You want the truth in this world? You have to figure it out. You want respect in this world? You must demand it. You want dignity in this world? You must assert it yourself. And that is why the attitude of this white person, it's been like this for centuries, vis-a-vis this world, is often, well, I am willing to take the risk. I have enough self-confidence to be able to take the risk. While the colonized, the indigenous populations shrink into themselves. They learn fear, not adventure. They learn the lack of safety is the presumption of their life. And they learn some deadly, toxic lessons, like to honor someone, you have to obey them. And because of that lesson, they keep passing on the mistakes of one generation to the other. And the same problems, generation to generation to generation. Now here is the utmost paradox. That, again, you want to see the effects of this disassociation that I'm talking about. Look at the matter from the perspective of the parents, not the child. Do you think these parents don't know that their child had reached the point of kufr? This woman had reached the point where she stopped believing in Islam. Do you want to see the real paradox? Do you want to see how grotesque this association is? I will tell you that those parents are more than happy to notice the kufr of their daughter, that she's no longer a Muslim, and to pretend it's not there. And as long as their daughter doesn't join demonstrations, doesn't protest what's happening to Palestinians, stays home and be a hypocrite, as long as she stays home and to pretend to be a Muslim, although they know she's pretending to be a Muslim, and marries when she's supposed to marry, and preferably marry the type of person that impresses the parents, some schmuck who has a good job and a high salary, but who cares if they have any Islamic backbone, or Islamic ethics, or Islamic morality. Those parents will be happy. This is what really blows your mind. Those parents will be happier with a hypocrite daughter who is not really a Muslim than an authentically Muslim daughter who does what in their mind is unsafe, like joining demonstrations and standing up for Palestine. What could be more disassociative? What could be a more glaring proof of disassociation than the fact that this describes the vast majority of our parents? Our very relation to Islam is so hypocritically pathological. Oh, we've got the greatest religion. Well, why is it the greatest religion? Well, it orders women to cover up. Does it have anything to say to humanity? Oh, we're not sure. Don't bother us. Well, there's a hadith about when you pray, you must have an izar on. You must have a shoulder cover on. That's what our religion contributes to the world. That is thorough, because intuitively, if someone gave you a lie detector test, it would show that you don't really believe what you are saying. That's disassociation. A world full of falsehood, of insincerity. And yes, you want to know what is the result of a culture that has become this way? The result is Saudi Arabia. The result is the United Arab Emirates. The result is Sisi of Egypt. The result is the mullahs of Iran. Intuitively, we know that this is really messed up. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم واسأل الله يستجب لكم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والحمد لله رب العالمين وسبحان الله العلي العظيم. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. No civilization, no real progress was ever built on the blind obedience of anyone to anyone. That is the amazing thing. Respect, yes. Honor, yes. Blind obedience, no. And it is not just those who broke away from their families and joined the Prophet ﷺ. But think of every young person who joined the armies of Abu Bakr in the first civil war. Think of every young person who joined the armies of the Islamic armies that took on the Byzantines. Think of every young person who joined Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. A very risky and precarious cause, but a just cause. And the first failure of the Islamic Ummah is when so many young people failed to join the right cause, was Imam al-Hussein, and preferred safety and sat next to their parents at home. The result, we are paying the price for that act of cowardliness and disassociation to our very day. Think of every young person who took risks that were incomprehensible to their parents as they traveled new routes to make new discoveries for the civilization that was. Think of all those who traveled for years in pursuit of knowledge. Do you think the Islamic civilization was built by kids who sat next to their parents obediently? Do you think these parents who would say goodbye to their child as they traveled the next 10 years in pursuit of knowledge, they were so different than us that they were happy to say goodbye to their kids, not knowing whether they're going to survive the journey in the desert or whether they're going to be accosted by highway robbers and murdered? They were not different, but they were not disassociated. They understood that when you become a Muslim, you embrace the idea of living for principles, and that you cannot obey anyone blindly, and that honor and respect is one thing. Blind obedience is, before anything else, disrespectful to the self and to God. And that's why it's shirk. So that woman that wrote me this letter, the irony of all ironies is that I am confident that as her parents are telling her to stay home and to stop protesting and stop being active for Palestine, that if she does stay home and she stops listening to Usuli and she loses her faith, as long as she just doesn't put her lack of faith in their face, as long as she doesn't confront them with her lack of iman, they'll be happy. Wouldn't you call that a disassociated state? Wouldn't you call that the extremity of paradoxical behavior? I have repeatedly pointed to examples of, in the same way that you point to examples of losing cultures that have been, in fact, traumatized by invaders, colonizers. Also, I've pointed to examples of the opposite. One of the things that recently struck me, I know a Palestinian student who was consistently protesting and speaking out. And lo and behold, I learned that this student was one of the, not just few, one of the nearly, here in Ohio, was a singular achievement. This student was nominated to a Rhodes Scholarship and nominated to a Marshall Scholarship. My own experience in life has taught me the following. Your enemy respects bravery and is more vicious towards you as you exhibit cowardliness. The very same people who have colonized indigenous folks learn to honor those who deserve to be honored, to admire bravery, even to admire resistance in due time. And just look, in my own law school, I have mentioned this in a previous khutbah, but it deserves to be mentioned again. It was Jewish students, Jewish law students, who sued their own university to demand the rights of Jews on campus. And the lawsuit, which is a lawsuit that I completely disagree with, but you admire the presence of these, the intentionality, the bravery of these individuals who decided to demand the rights of their own people, going to the lengths of suing the school that they study in and demanding their own rights. What do you think happened? All that happened is that the same university that was sued by its own students will think 10 times before crossing the rights of these students, or somehow not honoring the rights of these students. It hurts me when I think of the Muslim counterpart. Can I imagine a Muslim law student suing his own school to demand the rights of Muslims, to defend the rights of Muslims? It is inconceivable to me, because I know the Muslim psychology, because I know that this student will be told by his or her parents and his or her community, oh, let's not make trouble, let's not create waves, oh, this could happen, that could happen, they could retaliate in this way. And Allah is not ever present in any of their calculations. We've all heard the expression that religion can be the opiate of the people. Well, the way that religion can be an opiate is when religion is used to disassociate. When religion is not just disassociated from, but is disassociated with. So you actually use religion to disassociate from being fully present in your moment. When you're fully present, you are fully aware of what your world demands of you, what your principles are, what your boundaries are, where you are standing, what you are standing on, what are your goals, what you are going to pursue. And I would argue, when you're fully present, you are fully aware of your relationship to your Lord. And you are fully aware that your endeavor on this earth is a partnership between yourself and your Lord. Your Lord is not going to take over for you. Your Lord is not going to do it for you, but your Lord is sure going to help you. And your Lord will ultimately evaluate and judge you. That's being fully present. But when religion is used to disassociate, a religious person adopts all the characteristics of a person who is high, of a person who is intoxicated in medieval texts. This person simply avoids living with the realities of life by being addicted to reading medieval prescriptions and trying to twist and shape the self to fit these medieval prescriptions. Or a person who is constantly fantasizing about the coming of a savior or the curses of Antichrist, or that this world doesn't matter because it's all about the hereafter. And they live in a non-harmonized, non-synchronized relationship with their world. This is not what Islam came to teach. I'm going to end with this. For students of the Seerah, for students of the life of the Prophet ﷺ, I want you to study the Seerah. And I challenge everyone out there to come back and give me an example from the Seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, in which the Prophet was not fully present in his moment. Put differently, give me an example from the Seerah in which the Prophet ﷺ exhibited the signs of a disassociated person. Whether the Prophet was with his family, or his companions, or his community, or the challenges to his community, you see a human being who is fully present in the moment. I challenge you to find in the authentic Sunnah of the Prophet any teaching that encourages a Muslim to disassociate from the reality of their world. Why am I underscoring this so heavily? Because the ailments, the generational ailments of a disassociated people leaves us with paradoxes and inconsistencies that are deadly to the soul. And one of the main inconsistencies and paradoxes and traumas is despotism itself. The equating of obedience with honor and respect is authoritarianism itself. Is to live a life thinking that somehow I am contributing to the world, although in fact I contribute very little other than just consuming. I make no inventions, I make no progress, I make generationally passed down forms of disassociation. While for many indigenous cultures that have been conquered and have vanished, or on their way to vanishing either, when it comes to Islam, you cannot accept that conclusion. We cannot vanish. And we must commit ourselves not to the same old, but to radically and honestly looking within to recommit to the normative, ethical universe that is core to the Islamic message. اللهم اغفر لنا اللهم اعف عنا اللهم ارحمنا يا رب العالمين اللهم اهدنا لأقرب من هذا رشدا يا رب العالمين. Allah forgive our sins. Ya Rabb, guide us to the truth. Guide us to be fully present in our moment, to confront ourselves with our falsehoods and lies, to confront ourselves with our forms of avoidance and disassociation. Allah, guide us to never equate obedience and honor and respect, to always have the sense to know how to honor and respect our elders, but never blindly obey anyone. قولوا قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم أسأل الله يستجب لكم وأقم الصلاة.